Scottish society in the Middle Ages is the social organisation of what is now Scotland between the departure of the Romans from Britain in the 5th century and the establishment of the Renaissance in the early 16th century. Social structure is obscure in the early part of the period, for which there are few documentary sources. Kinship groups probably provided the primary system of organisation, and society was probably divided between a small aristocracy, whose rationale was based around warfare, a wider group of freemen, who had the right to bear arms and were represented in law codes, above the relatively large body of slaves, who may have lived beside and become clients of their owners. From the 12th century there are sources that allow the stratification in society to be seen in detail, with layers including the king and a small elite of mormaers above lesser ranks of freemen and what was probably a large group of serfs, particularly in central Scotland. In this period the feudalism introduced under David I meant that baronial lordships began to overlay this system. The English terms earl and thane became widespread. Below the noble ranks were husbandmen with small farms and growing numbers of cotters and greasemen with more modest landholdings. The combination of agnatic kinship and feudal obligations has been seen as creating the system of clans in the Highlands in this era. Scottish society adopted theories of the three estates to describe its society and English terminology to differentiate ranks. Serfdom disappeared from the records in the 14th century and new social groups of labourers, craftsmen and merchants became important in the developing burghs. This led to increasing social tensions in urban society, but, in contrast to England and France, there was a lack of major unrest in Scottish rural society, where there was relatively little economic change. Early Middle Ages. Kinship. The primary unit of social organization in Germanic and Celtic Europe of the early Middle Ages was the kin group, and this was probably the case in early medieval Scotland. The mention of descent through the female line in the ruling families of the Picts in later sources and the recurrence of leaders clearly from outside of Pictish society has led to the conclusion that the system of descent was matrilineal. However, this has been challenged by a number of historians who argue that the clear evidence of awareness of descent through the male line suggests that this more likely to indicate an agnatic system of descent, typical of Celtic societies and common throughout North Britain. Social structure. Scattered evidence, including the records in Irish annals and the visual images like the warriors depicted on the Pictish stone slabs at Aberlumno, Forfarshire and Hilton of Cadboll in East Ross, suggest that in northern Britain, as in Anglo-Saxon England, the upper ranks of society formed a military aristocracy, whose status was largely dependent on their ability and willingness to fight. Below the level of the aristocracy, it is assumed that there were non-noble freemen, working their own small farms or holding them as free tenants. There are no surviving law codes from Scotland in this period, but such codes in Ireland and Wales indicate that freemen had the right to bear arms, represent themselves in law and to receive compensation for murdered kinsmen. Slavery. Indications of that society in North Britain contained relatively large numbers of slaves, often taken in war and raids, or bought as St. Patrick indicated the Picts were doing. For the Britons in southern Scotland, slave-owning probably reached relatively far down in society, with most rural households containing some slaves, because they were taken relatively young and were usually racially indistinguishable from the masters. Many slaves would have been more integrated into the societies of capture than the societies of origin, in terms of both culture and language. language. Living and working beside their owners, in practice they may have become members of a household without the inconvenience of the partible inheritance rights that divided estates. Where there is better evidence from England and elsewhere, it was common for slaves who survived to middle age to gain the freedom, with such freedmen often remaining clients of the families of the former masters. Religious life in the early medieval era. Most evidence of religious practice comes from monks and is heavily biased towards monastic life. For this can be seen the daily cycle of prayers and the celebration of the Mass. There was also the business of farming, fishing, and in the islands, seal hunting. Literary life revolved around the contemplation of texts and the copying of manuscripts. Libraries were of great importance to monastic communities. The one at Iona may have been exceptional, but it demonstrates that the monks were part of the mainstream of European Christian culture. Less well recorded, but is significant, was the role of bishops and their clergy. Bishops dealt with the leaders of the twelfth, ordained clergy and consecrated churches. They also had responsibilities for the poor, hungry, prisoners, widows and orphans. Priests carried out baptisms, masses and burials. They also prayed for the dead and offered sermons. They anointed the sick with oil, brought communion to the dying and administered penance to sinners. Early local churches were widespread, but since they were largely made of wood, like that excavated at Whithorn, the only evidence that survives for most is in place names that contain words for church, including Sill, both Eccles and Anet, but others are indicated by stone crosses and Christian burials. Beginning on the west coast and islands and spreading south and east, these were replaced with basic masonry-built buildings. Education. In the early Middle Ages, Scotland was overwhelmingly an oral society, and education was verbal rather than literary. Fuller sources for Ireland of the same period suggest that there may have been Fili, who acted as poets, musicians and historians, often attached to the court of a lord or king, and passed on the knowledge in Gaelic to the next generation. After the de-Gallicization of the Scottish court from the 12th century, a less highly regarded order of bards took over these functions, and they would continue to act in a similar role in the Highlands and Islands into the 18th century. They often trained in bardic schools, of which a few, like the one run by the mormaer dynasty, who were bards to the Lord of the Isles, existed in Scotland and a larger number in Ireland, until they were suppressed from the 17th century. Much of the work was never written down, and what survives was only recorded from the 16th century. The establishment of Christianity brought Latin to Scotland as a scholarly and written language. Monasteries served as major repositories of knowledge and education, are often running schools and providing a small educated elite, who were essential to create and read documents in a largely illiterate society. High Middle Ages. Ranks. The legal tract known as Laws of the Bretts and Scots, probably compiled in the reign of David I, underlines the importance of the kin group as entitled to compensation for the killing of individual members. It also lists 5 grades of man: king, mormaer, twelfth, octagon and naefs. The highest rank below the king, the mormaer, was probably composed of about a dozen provincial rulers. Below them the twelfth appear to have managed areas of the royal domain, or that of a mormaer or abbot, within which they would have held substantial estates, sometimes described as shires. The lowest free rank mentioned by the Laws of the Bretts and Scots, the octagon, is a term the text does not translate into French. There were probably relatively large numbers of free peasant farmers, called husbandmen, in the south and north of the country, but fewer in the lands between the Forth and Sutherland. This changed from the 12th century, when landlords began to encourage the formation of such a class through paying better wages and deliberate immigration. Below the husbandman, a class of free farmers with smaller parcels of land developed, with cotters and grazing choosing tenants. The non-free bondmen, navati, naefs or serfs existed in various forms of service, under terms with their origins in Irish practice, including cumelaich, cumherba and scowloch, who were tied to a lord's estate and unable to leave it without permission, but who records indicate often absconded for better wages or work in other regions, or in the developing burghs. Feudalism. The feudalism introduced under David I, particularly in the east and south where the crown's authority was greatest, saw the placement of lordships, often based on castles, and the creation of administrative sheriffdoms, which overlay the pattern of administration by local thanes. Land was now held from the king, or a superior lord, in exchange for loyalty and forms of service that were usually military. It also saw the English earl and Latin comes begin to replace the mormaers in the records. However, the imposition of feudalism continued to sit beside existing system of landholding and tenure, and it is not clear how this change impacted on the lives of the ordinary free and unfree workers. In places, feudalism may have tied workers more closely to the land, but the predominantly pastoral nature of Scottish agriculture may have made the imposition of a manorial system, based on the English model, impracticable. Obligations appear to have been limited to occasional labor service, seasonal renders of food, hospitality, and money rents. Royal women. A large proportion of the women for whom biographical details survive for the Middle Ages were members of the royal houses of Scotland, either as princesses or queen consorts. Some of these became important figures in the history of Scotland and gained a significant posthumous reputation. There was only one reigning Scottish queen in this period, the uncrowned and short-lived Margaret, Maid of Norway. The first wife called Queen in Scottish sources is the Anglo-Saxon and German Princess Margaret, the wife of Malcolm III, which may have been a title and status negotiated by her relatives. She was a major political and religious figure within the kingdom, but her status was not automatically passed on to her successors, most of whom did not have the same prominence. Ermengarde de Beaumont, the wife of William I, acted as a mediator, judge in her husband's absence, and is the first Scottish queen known to have had her own seal. Monasticism. Some early Scottish monasteries had dynasties of abbots, who were often secular clergy with families, as at Dunkeld and Brechin. Perhaps in reaction to this secularization, a reforming movement of monks called acute anglicized as culdees, began in Ireland and spread to Scotland in the late 8th and early 9th centuries. Some acute took vows of chastity and poverty, and while some lived individually as hermits, others lived beside within existing monasteries. The introduction of continental forms of monasticism to Scotland is associated with Queen Margaret. She was in communication with Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury, and he provided a few monks for a new Benedictine abbey at Dunfermline. Subsequent foundations under Margaret's sons, Edgar, Alexander and particularly David I, tended to be of the reform type that followed the lead set by Cluny Abbey in the Loire from the late 10th century. Most belonged to the new religious orders that originated in France in the 11th and 12th centuries. These stressed the original Benedictine virtues of poverty, chastity and obedience, but also contemplation and service of the Mass, and were followed in various forms by Reformed Benedictine, Augustinian and Cistercian houses. This period also saw the introduction of more sophisticated forms of church architecture that had become common on the continent and in England, known collectively as Romanesque. Saints. One of the main features of medieval Catholicism was the cult of saints. Saints of Irish origin who were particularly revered included various figures called St. Fiellan and St. Colman, and Saints Finbar and Finan. Columba remained a major figure into the 14th century, and a new foundation was endowed by William I at Arbroath Abbey, and his relics, contained in the Mormaers reliquary, were handed over to the abbot's care. Regional saints remained important to local identities. In Strathclyde, the most important saint was St. Kentigern, whose cult became focused in Glasgow. In Lothian it was St. Cuthbert, whose relics were carried across the Northumbria after Lindisfarne was sacked by the Vikings before being installed in Durham Cathedral. After his martyrdom around 1115, a cult emerged in Orkney, Shetland and northern Scotland around Magnus Erlingson, Earl of Orkney. One of the most important cults in Scotland, that of St. Andrew, was established on the east coast at Kilrymont by the Pictish kings as early as the 8th century. The shrine, which from the 12th century was said to have contained the relics of the saint brought to Scotland by St. Regulus, began to attract pilgrims from across Scotland, but also from England and further away. By the 12th century, the site at Kilrymont had become known simply as St. Andrews, and it became increasingly associated with Scottish national identity and the royal family. Its bishop would supplant that of Dunkeld as the most important in the kingdom, and would begin to be referred to as Bishop of Alba. The site was renewed as a focus for devotion with the patronage of Queen Margaret, who also became important after her canonization in 1250 and after the ceremonial transfer of her remains to Dunfermline Abbey. As one of the most revered national saints, schools in the High Middle Ages, there were new sources of education, such as song and grammar schools. These were usually attached to cathedrals or a collegiate church, and were most common in the developing burghs. By the end of the Middle Ages, grammar schools could be found in all the main burghs and some small towns. Early examples including the High School of Glasgow in 1124 and the High School of Dundee in 1239. There were also petty schools, more common in rural areas and providing an elementary education.